The morning mist clung to the French countryside like the breath of dying men, and Colonel Hanson Eli knew that within hours, American blood would stain European soil for the first time in this war. It was May 28, 1918, and the village of Cantigny, a name most of his men couldn't even pronounce correctly, lay before them. Like a challenge thrown down by the Kaiser himself, Eli stood in the forward observation post, his weathered hands gripping the rim of his field glasses as he studied the German positions that had turned the quaint French village into a fortress of death. The 28th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now the weight of American military honor rested squarely on their shoulders. Behind him, 4,000 doughboys crouched in their trenches, many of them farm boys from Kansas and factory workers from Detroit who had never imagined they would be the first Americans to launch a sustained offensive against the German war machine. The village itself seemed to mock their preparations. What had once been a peaceful farming community of perhaps 200 souls was now a maze of machine gun nests, artillery positions, and reinforced bunkers. The Germans of the 18th Army had spent months fortifying every barn, every house, every garden wall. Church bells that once called villagers to prayer now served as observation posts for enemy snipers, who could pick off an unwary American from 800 yards away. As referenced in the Army Historical Foundation's detailed analysis of the engagement, this operation marked an important moment in the history of the U.S. Army, for it would prove whether American forces could fight as effectively as their European allies who had been bleeding in these trenches for nearly 4 years. The pressure was immense, not just from the German guns that had been pounding their positions with methodical precision, but from the expectations of a nation that had committed itself to this war. With grand promises of swift victory, General Robert Lee Bullard, commanding the 1st Division, had made it clear to his officers that failure was not an option. The French were watching, the British were watching, and most importantly, the Germans were watching to see if these Americans were merely naive volunteers or genuine soldiers. The village of Cantigny, strategically positioned on high ground, overlooking the Somme River Valley, had become far more than a military objective. It was a test of American resolve and capability. In the pre-dawn darkness, Eli could hear the rumble of French tanks moving into position, their steel treads crushing the spring flowers that had somehow managed to bloom despite the devastation of war. The combined arms approach they would use coordinating infantry, artillery, tanks, engineers, and aviation in a synchronized assault was revolutionary for its time, and the success or failure of this new doctrine would be written in the blood of his men. The colonel checked his pocket watch. 0 for 100 hours. In 2 hours, the artillery barrage would begin, and 30 minutes after that, his men would go over the top into history. Some would return as heroes, others would remain forever in the soil of France, but all would be remembered as the Americans who proved their nation belonged in this terrible war. The artillery preparation began at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, with a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the earth apart. Colonel Eli felt the ground beneath his feet shudder as over 200 French and American guns opened fire simultaneously, their shells screaming overhead toward the German positions in Cantigny. The barrage was so intense that men 3 miles away would later report that the earth moved beneath them like an earthquake. Captain Clarence Hubner of the 28th Infantry 2nd Battalion crouched in the forward trench, watching his men's faces in the flickering light of the artillery flashes. These were no longer the eager recruits who had arrived in France 6 months earlier, full of romantic notions about war and glory. The constant German bombardments of the past month had hardened them, taught them the difference between courage and survival, between bravery and foolishness. Every man knew that in 30 minutes they would advance across 400 yards of open ground against an enemy that had been perfecting the art of killing for 4 years. The German response to the American barrage was swift and devastating. Within minutes of the first American shells landing in Cantigny, German artillery began falling on the American positions with a precision that came from weeks of careful range finding. The enemy had registered every American trench, every communication line, every assembly area. Shells burst with mechanical regularity, sending geysers of mud and shrapnel into the air. Private First Class Michael Thompson from Ohio pressed himself against the forward wall of the trench as a shell exploded 20 yards to his left, showering him with debris and the acrid smell of high explosive. First Lieutenant George Marshall, serving as operations officer for the 1st Division, moved through the trenches with remarkable calm. checking on the men and ensuring that communications remained intact. The young officer, who would later become one of America's greatest military leaders, understood that this battle would set the tone for every American engagement that followed. His careful planning had accounted for every detail: the timing of the artillery lifts, the coordination with French tanks, the positioning of reserves, and the evacuation routes for wounded men. As the minutes ticked toward 0 hour, sergeants began moving along the trenches, their voices cutting through the artillery thunder with final instructions and encouragement. Sergeant Major Daniel Edwards, a regular Army veteran who had served on the Mexican border, stopped at each squad to ensure weapons were clean, bayonets fixed, and gas masks ready. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes conveyed the gravity of what was about to unfold. These men were not just representing their regiment or their division. They carried the honor of the entire American Expeditionary Force. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every man in the forward trenches knew that failure at Cantigny would vindicate German propaganda that portrayed Americans as soft and unprepared for European warfare. Success, however, would announce to the world that America had arrived as a military power capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with the battle-tested armies of France and Britain. At 06:25 hours, whistles began shrieking along the American lines. The artillery fire shifted from the village itself to the German reserve positions and communication trenches, following a precisely timed schedule that would lift the barrage progressively ahead of the advancing infantry. Colonel Eli raised his arm, then brought it down sharply. Along a front of nearly 2 miles, 4,000 American soldiers rose from their trenches and began walking steadily toward Cantigny, their rifles held at port arms, their faces set with grim determination. The advance across no man's land began with deceptive calm, as if the early morning mist could somehow shield the Americans from the reality of what awaited them. Captain Hubner led his company forward at a steady walk, following the doctrine that had been hammered into them during weeks of training: maintain formation, follow the artillery barrage closely, and never run unless ordered. The ground beneath their feet was torn and cratered from months of shelling, forcing the men to navigate around shell holes filled with stagnant water and the grim debris of previous battles. For the first 100 yards, German resistance seemed surprisingly light. A few machine guns chattered sporadically from the village, but the devastating American artillery barrage had clearly disrupted the enemy's defensive preparations. Private Thompson, advancing with the first wave, began to hope that perhaps the stories of German efficiency and resistance had been exaggerated. That hope died abruptly when the artillery barrage lifted from the village and shifted to targets deeper behind German lines. The moment the shells stopped falling on Cantigny itself, the village erupted with German fire. Machine guns that had been carefully concealed and protected during the bombardment now opened up with murderous precision. The distinctive ripping sound of the German Maxim guns filled the air, interspersed with the sharper crack of rifles and the deeper boom of artillery pieces that the American barrage had failed to silence. Men began falling along the entire front, some crying out, others dropping silently into the mud. Sergeant Edwards, advancing with the 3rd Squad of B Company, watched as his men instinctively began to bunch together under fire, exactly what their training had warned against. Spread out, he roared over the din of battle, pushing men to the left and right to maintain proper interval. A machine gun burst caught to men directly in front of him, spinning them around and dropping them into a shell crater. Edwards didn't pause to check on them. That was the job of the stretcher bearers following behind, but pressed forward with the inexorable advance that had been drilled into every American soldier. The French tanks, 12 Renault light tanks, that were supposed to support the infantry advance, had mixed success in the broken terrain. 3 tanks became bogged down in shell craters within the first 200 yards, their crews forced to abandon the vehicles and continue the advance on foot. The remaining tanks, however, proved invaluable in suppressing German strong points. That might have stopped the infantry assault entirely. Lieutenant Charles Whittlesey, commanding one of the lead platoons, watched with satisfaction as a French tank methodically destroyed a German machine gun position that had been decimating his men. As the Americans reached the outskirts of Cantigny, the nature of the battle changed from open advance to house-to-house fighting. The Germans had prepared defensive positions in every structure, turning civilian homes into fortified bunkers connected by communication trenches. Each house had to be taken individually, often at considerable cost. Grenades flew through windows, and doorways as Americans and Germans fought for control of individual rooms. Private First Class James Harrison from Tennessee found himself leading a squad into what had once been the village bakery, now transformed into a German strongpoint. The enemy had knocked loopholes through the stone walls and positioned the light machine guns to cover the main street. Harrison's squad took the building by the brutal but effective method of bombing each room with grenades before entering, a technique that saved American lives, but left the village increasingly damaged. By 0800 hours, barely an hour and a half after the initial advance began, American forces had fought their way into the heart of Cantigny, but taking the village, as difficult as it had been, would prove to be only the beginning of their ordeal. The capture of Cantigny's central square at 0815 hours marked a moment of grim triumph for the 28th Infantry Regiment, but Colonel Ely knew that holding the village would prove far more challenging than taking it. German doctrine called for immediate counterattacks against any lost position, and the Americans had barely begun to organize their defenses when the first enemy response came screaming out of the morning sky. German artillery, which had been silent during the American assault to avoid hitting their own troops, now opened up with devastating accuracy on the captured village. The enemy had spent months plotting every building, every intersection, every possible defensive position that attacking forces might use. Shells began falling with methodical precision, turning the stone houses that Americans had fought so hard to capture into death traps of flying debris and collapsing walls. Captain Hubner, now commanding the defense of the eastern sector of the village, quickly realized that the tactics which had won Cantigny would not suffice to hold it. The Americans needed to transform from an attacking force into a defensive one, and they had to do it while under constant artillery bombardment. And with German counterattacks clearly imminent, his men began the desperate work of turning German defensive positions to face the opposite direction, a task complicated by the fact that many of the original fortifications had been destroyed in the American bombardment. First Lieutenant Marshall, coordinating the defense from a hastily established command post in what remained of the village church, faced the complex challenge of maintaining communication with scattered units while under constant fire. The telephone lines that had been carefully laid during the advance were being systematically destroyed by German artillery, forcing runners to carry messages through streets swept by machine gun fire and random shell bursts. 3 runners were killed in the first hour of occupation, their messages dying with them in the rubble of Cantigny streets. The first German counterattack came at 0930 hours, launched by elements of the 25th Reserve Division that had been held in reserve specifically for this purpose. The companies of German infantry, supported by their own artillery barrage, advanced from the northeast in a disciplined attack that demonstrated why the German army remained one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. Unlike the Americans' methodical advance, the German assault came in swift rushes from cover to cover, with machine gun teams providing suppressive fire while assault squads closed with the defenders. Sergeant Edwards, now commanding what remained of his original platoon after the morning's casualties, found his position in a destroyed farmhouse under attack by a German squad, armed with the new MP-18 submachine guns. The rapid fire from these weapons was devastating in close quarters, but Edwards had learned something crucial during the advance. German troops, for all their skill and experience, could be beaten by Americans who refused to give ground and maintain disciplined fire control. The fighting for individual buildings resumed with savage intensity, but now the Americans were the defenders and the Germans the attackers. Private Thompson, wounded in the leg during the morning assault but still capable of fighting, found himself in a 3-hour battle for control of a single house that changed hands for times. Each room was contested with grenades, rifle fire, and often hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and rifle butts. The close-quarters combat was exhausting and nerve-wracking, with men fighting enemies they could hear but often couldn't see through the smoke and debris. What made the American defense particularly effective was their integration with the French tanks that had supported the initial assault. The tank crews, rather than withdrawing after the village was captured, remained to provide mobile fire support against German counterattacks. When German assault troops attempted to advance up the main street toward the village square, they found themselves caught in crossfire between American infantry in the buildings and French tank guns that could destroy any cover the Germans might seek. By noon, the Americans had repulsed 3 separate German counterattacks, each one more determined than the last. The cost had been severe. Casualty reports indicated that some companies were down to half strength, but Cantigny remained In American hands, Colonel Ely, surveying the devastated village from his forward command post, knew that the real test was yet to come. German doctrine called for increasingly powerful counterattacks until a lost position was recaptured, and the enemy had barely begun to commit their available reserves. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the devastated landscape, German artillery fire intensified to a level that veteran French observers described as unprecedented for such a small objective. The enemy clearly understood the symbolic importance of Cantigny. This was not merely about one French village, but about preventing American forces from establishing themselves as effective combatants on the Western Front. Every building in the village shook under the constant bombardment, and men who had fought bravely all morning began to show the strain of continuous combat. The fourth German counterattack came at 1300 hours with a ferocity that caught even experienced American officers by surprise. 3 full companies of German infantry, supported by flamethrower teams and accompanied by their own light artillery pieces that had been moved forward during the morning, launched a coordinated assault on multiple sectors of the American defense simultaneously. This was not the probing attack of earlier efforts, but a full-scale attempt to retake Cantigny through sheer overwhelming force. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the former president's son, who was serving as a battalion commander in the 26th Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to prepare his unit as a reserve in case the defense of Cantigny failed. From his position 2 miles behind the village, Roosevelt could see the intensity of the German bombardment and understood that the Americans in Cantigny were fighting not just for their lives, but for the credibility of the entire American expeditionary force. His men checked their weapons and equipment repeatedly, knowing they might be called forward at any moment. Captain Charles Seney, now commanding what remained of 2 decimated companies, found his sector under attack by German stormtroopers using the infiltration tactics that had proved so effective during the spring offensive. Rather than advancing in waves as the Americans had done, the Germans moved in small groups, seeking weak points in the defense and attempting to penetrate deep into the American position before the defenders could react. This type of fighting required constant vigilance and quick decision-making by individual soldiers and squad leaders. The flamethrower attack on the eastern edge of the village created panic among some of the newer American soldiers who had never faced this terrifying weapon before. The sight of liquid fire arcing through the air and the agonized screams of men caught by the flames broke the nerve of an entire squad, who began falling back toward the village center. Sergeant Major Edwards, despite his own wounds from the morning's fighting, rallied these men with a combination of encouragement and harsh discipline that reflected his years of regular Army service. Private Harrison, who had distinguished himself in the morning's house-to-house fighting, found himself leading a desperate defense of the village bakery against a German flamethrower team. The enemy had advanced to within 30 yards of his position when Harrison made a decision that would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross. Rather than wait for the flamethrower to reach effective range, he led a bayonet charge directly into the German position, killing 3 enemy soldiers and capturing the flamethrower equipment that the Americans then turned against subsequent German attacks. What saved the American defense during this critical period was not just individual heroism, but the effective coordination between different combat arms that had been planned so carefully before the battle. When German infantry threatened to overrun the northwestern sector of the village, American artillery observers were able to call down precisely targeted fire. From batteries positioned 3 miles to the rear, the shells landed within 50 yards of American positions, requiring extraordinary precision and confidence between the observers and the gun crews. The French tanks, now reduced to 7 operational vehicles, proved their worth again during the afternoon fighting, when a German assault team managed to establish a position in the village square itself, threatening to split the American defense in 2. A single Renault tank drove directly into the square and systematically destroyed the German position with point-blank cannon fire. The tank crew, all of whom were wounded by the end of the engagement, continued fighting from their damaged vehicle until ammunition ran low. By 1600 hours, the 4th German counterattack had been repulsed, but at terrible cost to both sides. American casualties were approaching 30% and ammunition was running critically low. More ominously, German artillery fire showed no signs of diminishing. An aerial reconnaissance reported that fresh enemy reserves were moving toward Cantigny under cover of the afternoon shadows. As evening approached on May 28th, The character of the battle for Cantigny began to shift from desperate defense to a test of pure endurance. German artillery fire, rather than diminishing as might be expected after nearly 12 hours of continuous bombardment, actually increased in intensity. The enemy was clearly determined to make the American occupation of the village so costly that future offensive operations would be discouraged. Colonel Ely, coordinating the defense from a command post that had been moved 3 times due to direct artillery hits, realized that his men were fighting the battle simultaneously, one against German infantry and another against their own exhaustion and depleted supplies. The ammunition situation had become critical by 1700 hours. Many rifle companies were down to fewer than 20 rounds per man, and machine gun crews were rationing their fire to only the most clearly defined targets. Supply parties attempting to bring forward ammunition and medical supplies were taking severe casualties from German artillery fire that seemed to target every approach route to the village. 3 separate supply convoys had been destroyed during the afternoon, their precious cargo scattered across the cratered landscape between Cantigny and the American rear positions. Lieutenant George Patton, Jr., then serving as a staff officer with the 1st Division, volunteered to lead a supply convoy forward despite the dangerous conditions. The future general, who would later command armies in World War II, demonstrated the aggressive leadership style that would characterize his entire career by personally driving the lead truck through German artillery fire to deliver desperately needed ammunition to the defenders. His convoy lost the vehicles to direct hits, but managed to deliver enough supplies to keep the American defense viable for several more hours. The 5th German counterattack began at 1800 hours and represented the enemy's most sophisticated effort yet to retake the village. Rather than launching frontal assaults that had been bloodily repulsed throughout the day, German commanders attempted to infiltrate the American positions, using the network of communication trenches and cellar tunnels that connected many of the village buildings. Small teams of German soldiers, moving underground and through damaged structures, suddenly appeared in the rear of American defensive positions, creating confusion and forcing the defenders to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. Sergeant Edwards, now effectively commanding an entire company after officer casualties had decimated the leadership structure, found his men under attack from 3 different directions at once. German soldiers were firing from buildings that had supposedly been cleared hours earlier, while other enemy troops advanced openly down the main street. Under cover of intense artillery preparation, the complexity of the tactical situation required constant adaptation and improvisation by American soldiers who had never experienced this type of multi-directional urban combat. The psychological pressure on the American defenders was becoming as dangerous as the physical threats they faced. Men who had fought courageously all day began showing signs of combat fatigue, with some soldiers becoming unresponsive to orders and others displaying the nervous tremors that indicated approaching breakdown. Captain Hubner, himself wounded twice during the day's fighting, moved constantly among his men to provide encouragement and maintain unit cohesion. His presence alone seemed to steady soldiers who were reaching the limits of human endurance. The medical situation in Cantigny had become desperate by evening. The village aid station, established in the basement of what had been the local school, was overwhelmed with casualties that could not be evacuated due to constant artillery fire on all routes leading away from the village. Dr. Captain James Ryan, the regimental surgeon, performed operations by candlelight while shells exploded overhead, removing shrapnel and treating wounds under conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. As night began to fall over the battlefield, both American defenders and German attackers faced a crucial decision. The Americans had held Cantigny for nearly 12 hours against determined counterattacks, proving that they could fight effectively against veteran German troops. However, their casualties were severe, their supplies nearly exhausted, and their men approaching the breaking point of human endurance. The Germans, for their part, had committed substantial resources to retaking what was, strategically speaking, a relatively minor objective, but they could not afford to allow American forces to establish a reputation for battlefield effectiveness. The stage was set for the final phase of the battle, which would determine not just the fate of one French village, but the future role of American forces in the war. The final German assault began at 2100 hours under cover of darkness, representing the enemy's last major effort to reclaim Cantigny. Before fresh American reinforcements could arrive, German commanders had assembled nearly a full battalion for this attack, supported by artillery fire that was both more accurate and more intense than anything the Americans had experienced during the day. The bombardment was so severe that it could be heard clearly 15 miles away, and the ground shook continuously under the impact of high explosive shells. Colonel Eli, monitoring the situation from his 4th Command post of the day, knew that this attack would determine the outcome of the entire battle. His men had fought magnificently for 15 hours, but they were exhausted, low on ammunition, and reduced to barely half their original strength. Radio communication with Higher Headquarters had been severed by German artillery fire, leaving him to make critical decisions without guidance from division or corps commanders. The responsibility for America's first major offensive operation rested entirely on his shoulders. The German attack came simultaneously from 3 directions, demonstrating sophisticated tactical coordination despite the darkness and the chaos of the previous day's fighting. Enemy soldiers advanced through the ruins of the village using cover and concealment techniques perfected during 4 years of warfare, while machine gun teams provided suppressive fire that forced American defenders to keep their heads down during crucial moments of the assault. German artillery fire was precisely coordinated to lift from specific buildings. Just moments before infantry teams reached those positions, Private Thompson, still fighting despite multiple wounds sustained throughout the day, found himself in command of a mixed group of soldiers from 3 different companies, who had been consolidated into a single defensive position. The young soldier from Ohio, who had never held authority over anyone before enlisting, now made life and death decisions for a dozen men while under intense enemy fire. His leadership during this final phase of the battle would later be recognized with a Silver Star, though Thompson himself would always insist that he had simply done what was necessary to keep his men alive. The crucial moment of the battle came when German assault troops penetrated the American defensive line at 2 separate points, threatening to split the defense and force a general withdrawal from the village. Sergeant Major Edwards, despite wounds that would have justified his evacuation hours earlier, organized a counterattack using every available American soldier, including cooks, clerks, and wounded men who could still handle a rifle. The counterattack was launched with fixed bayonets in the darkness, American soldiers advancing by feel and instinct against German positions they could locate only by muzzle flashes, as documented in various historical accounts of this engagement. In the face of 7 fierce counterattacks that day and the next, the U.S. forces held their position with the loss of 1,067 casualties. They captured around 100 German prisoners. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was savage and decisive, with Americans and Germans grappling in the darkness among the ruins of what had once been peaceful civilian homes. Lieutenant Marshall, coordinating the defense despite a head wound that left him partially blinded, managed to reestablish communication with American artillery positions. Just as the German assault reached its peak intensity, the artillery support that followed was devastatingly effective, with shells landing within yards of American positions to break up German assault formations. The precision required for this type of fire support demonstrated the effectiveness of American training and the courage of forward observers, who remained at their posts despite constant danger. By midnight on May 28th, the German assault had been broken, and enemy forces were withdrawing from the immediate vicinity of Cantigny. The Americans had held their ground through sheer determination and mutual support, proving that they could fight as effectively as any army in Europe. The cost had been terrible, over 1,000 casualties in a single day's fighting, but the strategic and symbolic importance of the victory could hardly be overstated. As dawn broke on May 29, 1918, the American flag flew over Cantigny, the first time in the war that American forces had captured and held a significant objective against determined German resistance. The battle had lasted 24 hours and established the reputation of American forces as formidable opponents. The village itself was hardly recognizable, reduced to rubble by the intensity of the fighting, but its strategic importance paled beside its symbolic value. The Battle of Cantigny marked the true beginning of American participation in the Great War as an independent fighting force. The men who fought there, living and dead, had written the first chapter of American military involvement in European warfare, proving that democracy could produce soldiers equal to any in the world when the stakes were high enough and the cause was just.